Before we begin, a quick but important note. The conversation you're about to hear includes serious allegations of misconduct made by our guest. These are her personal accounts and perspectives, and at this time they remain allegations. The individuals and organizations named are entitled to respond, and nothing in this episode should be taken as a finding of guilt or liability. We share these stories because we believe it's in the public interest to discuss issues of safety and accountability in martial arts. If you're affected by the topics discussed here, please take care when listening. Hey everybody, welcome to Fighting Matters. I'm Steve Kwan. I'm here with my friends Shelby York and Jesse Walker from Rough Hands BJJ. How's it going, folks?
Hey, hey.
Hey, what's up, everybody?
Now, we got an interesting guest today here, doing the media rounds quite a bit recently, but this is an important enough story that we wanted to do our best to amplify it as well. We've got Jane Doe here, obviously an anonymized name, who has recently been making the rounds, shedding light on some stories that have come out of Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. But Jane, maybe I'll leave it to you to introduce yourself and the story as well, just so that people know what's going on.
Sure. Thank you so much, Steve. So I am a one-stripe white belt. I'm a hobbyist Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athlete, and I trained at a particular gym called Zuma here in Victoria for about a year and a half. And I've been speaking with a number of different media outlets about that experience, and namely about some really inappropriate sexual misconduct at the hands of the head coach there, Adam Zugec.
Got it. And for those who haven't heard the story, I think people in the jiu-jitsu community who keep an eye on the news have probably seen this covered in several places. There have been many stories about this that made pretty broad circulation and got shared on Reddit and on social. And of course, Rob from McDojo Life also covered this as well. But for people who maybe haven't heard this, what exactly happened at that school?
Sure. So I'm happy to share my experience, and then I know that many others had similar, if not worse, experiences than me. So I joined the gym. I had never done a combat sport. I'd never been in a gym like this. I was new to the city, and I joined because I had sort of one friend in the whole city. And I was like, "What are you into? What are your hobbies?" And he said, "Oh, I train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu." And I was like, "Well, how hard could that possibly be?" And it turns out it's quite challenging. But he was really popular within the gym. He knew the leadership. And so I met Adam almost immediately on my first or second day in. And I'd say right away that he made comments about my face. He made comments about my body. I had a lot of leering, and specifically, he stared a lot at my chest. He would make a lot of comments about who I was sleeping with. He would be recommending other athletes for me to sleep with. And he would be recommending I be sleeping with married men. He knew that I was in a committed relationship. He talked to me a lot about having babies, how I should have kids. Um, and so a lot of the conversations that we had were like 1 degree to no degree away from my vagina, just to be blunt. Uh, and I thought a lot of this was just sort of distasteful or crude or like not quite what I was expecting, but he was revered, and I don't use that word lightly, within the gym. And so I think I just sort of tolerated that. And then there were instances where he would hug me for too long, or like squeeze my arm or touch my thigh. And again, that made me sort of uncomfortable in the moment, but it wasn't enough to make me leave. Um, on another occasion, I remember coming back from vacation, having a suntan, and he said, "Oh my gosh, like you smell so good. This tan is so pretty. You smell good enough to eat." And I think he actually said, "You smell good enough to eat out." But I'm not sure. I can't fully remember if he said the last word in that sentence or not. But that was a particularly sort of creepy instance that I recall. Um, One time we were in the gym and I went to just like sit out for a round. I sat next to him. He was on his phone, and on his phone, he's looking at a photo of a woman, and it's a photo in black and white. It's a sort of European looking brunette woman, and she's wearing a blazer and nothing else. her legs are sort of splayed open, she's got full bush, and I was just kind of like, "Whoa, oh, okay, like, you're the you're the owner of this gym, people are here, there's 40 people in this gym training a combat sport, but you're off to the side and you're looking at, a nude and explicit image." Um, and he talked to me about that a little bit, and then I just got out of there and was like, that was bizarre and seems also just really unsafe and unprofessional." Um, there his wife is also, at the gym, she's a black belt, and so there was a Christmas party that occurred, and I went to their house, and, uh, parts of that evening were really fun, like, I got to meet female athletes that I wouldn't normally because they would be training at a different time, or maybe they were, like, a Muay Thai, athlete, and so that was fun, but that was an evening that left a really bad taste in my mouth, and I think that was the evening when I was like, "I'll never be alone with this guy again." And part of that is there was this really bizarre, like, sexual energy that was just in the room that is more of an intuition than him actually saying something explicit. Um, but the other thing that happened that night was I had a one-on-one conversation with Adam, and, he offered to photograph me, and he didn't say, like, "I'd like to shoot you and I'd like to shoot explicit photos," or "I'd like to shoot pornography," or "I'd like to shoot you topless or in the nude," but that was what I took away from that offer, and I think I reached that conclusion because he'd shown because we'd had this conversation about a woman who kind of looks like me who was in that photo that was at the gym. But also just kind of like the order of operations for the conversation for me was really disquieting. So I had specifically asked him for financial advice, and I was looking for that because my mom had died, and I came into some life insurance, and Adam's a wealthy man, and so I was hoping that he like had a money guy. And the conversation that we had was uh like, "Oh, I can't believe you lost your mom. I'm such a family guy. This must be so hard for you." And then he got really emotional and he was like teary-eyed. And then he transitioned that into, "Oh my gosh, you're so beautiful when you're upset. Like, I'd really love to photograph you." So that and in the moment, I was just kind of like, wow, that's a really predatory, really just like, "You're such a dick. Like, I can't believe you would take my dead mom, and, like, weaponize that to try to get explicit photos." Um, and so I think that particular evening for me was, like, a real turning point where I just knew, like, I don't trust this guy, I never wanna be alone with him. Um, but then the straw that really broke the camel's back happened in June, and that was a class where Adam was teaching a gi class, and so we're all there, and he like demonstrates this technique, and then he says, "Okay, and now I'm going to fight Jane." And I was just sort of like, "What? Like me? Like why on earth would why would that happen? Like you're 250 pounds, you're a black belt, like I'm pretty, I can like barely put the gi on. Like why would you ever want to roll with me?" And everybody laughs and like the class continues. And then I was with my training partner and one of the other instructors, and he came over again and he was like, "You're going to roll with me and then you're going to play Fortnite with me, and you're going to do that because a man told you to." And I laughed and I was like, "Adam,
Woof.
have you ever fucking met me?" Because it's a ludicrous thing to say to me, and it's laughable, and like those guys laughed. And then we went into rounds, and I think they would be the standard 4-minute rounds. And this whole time, Adam is always just kind of like buzzing around, like he's never very far. And so he's like, "Now we're gonna roll." And I was like, "I don't want to roll." And I grabbed his wife, who was there, who was on the mat, and like rolled with his wife. And then as soon as that's over, he's like, "We're rolling." And I spent a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes, telling him no and just saying like, "I don't want to roll with you. I don't want to touch you." And he's saying, I'm not going to hurt you. Don't worry about it. And I'm walking away. I'm saying, no, I don't want to roll. No, I don't want to touch you. Roll with someone else. Your wife is right there. And then at one point, I remember vividly, he said, come on, you're making me feel like I don't have consent right now. And I just told him, you don't. And he pulled my lapel. We get into this roll. I don't exactly remember what happened in those 2 minutes, but I know at one point, like, his head, his, like, sweaty, bald head is right in my chest. At one point, he's on top of me, which was terrifying, and I remember finishing the roll, and I was on top of him, and for that whole time that this is happening, I know rationally that I am not gonna get raped in a gi class in front of 40 people, but every part of my evolutionary brain, every part of my intuition, every cell in my body is just saying, like, "You're gonna get raped, it's going down, and you can't do a thing." I was really scared. And so
Sure.
the bell goes off, the round is over, and then he just is like, "You didn't do anything. You didn't fight." And, I just, like, nodded, but in my head, I was like, "No, I didn't fight. You scared me." Like, I froze. I did the thing that, like, all of evolution has programmed me to do. And I walked off the mat. My training partner asked, like, "How did that go?" And I said, "That was violating." And then I got out of my gi stuff, got in the car, and never went back. Um, and I'll say that when I left the gym, I didn't say, like, I'm leaving because Adam is a creep. I didn't really talk about the real reason why I was leaving. And it's only after I left the gym that I started to realize how ubiquitous his misconduct is. And I sort of recognized that this wasn't going to a good place. This continued to escalate. Like, you leer at me, then you show me pornography, then you talk about shooting explicit photos with me. You won't, but then when you won't take no for an answer, that's just a whole other realm of being unsafe, and I'm out of here. But I know that there are women who stayed past those points. Um, so I think, succinctly put, Steve, that that's kind of what led me to leave the gym. And then after I left the gym, I heard stories of other women who had been touched inappropriately, who felt unsafe, who felt like he was a predator. And the women wanted to do something, didn't really know what. There was talk of a petition, but folks didn't really know what to do or what to say or where. And so I just decided, like, I'll do it. And I made the Reddit post, and I thought, maybe like 5 people will read this. And then it turns out that 11 other women came forward with similar stories. And it generated a lot of really positive support, both within the gym itself. So I will say that, like, the male allyship that we've been shown has been really good. Almost all of his folks have left. I don't think he has any upper belts really left. And so I'm really grateful for that. And then the support from the media and the broader community has been really impressive and meaningful as well.
Holy moly. There's a lot of places we can take this. I guess one thing I just want to reiterate on first, and then I have a question. Actually, I want to get some feedback from Shelby and Jesse as gym owners. But how long had you been training roughly? This is your first experience with jiu-jitsu, right? And how long did this roughly go on for?
That's right. So I believe it was about a year and a half, from when I started to when I quit.
Okay. And I bring this up because many years ago, there was maybe the most famous incident of this kind of misconduct in the jiu-jitsu space with fight sports, where the management of fight sports was accused of being complicit in basically a child sex predator behavior that happened under their umbrella. And at the time, this got a lot of coverage in the jiu-jitsu community, right up to the New York Times, which is, I mean, look, as someone who's devoted a lot of his life to jiu-jitsu, it's very frustrating that this is the type of coverage that our sport is known for. But Avery Clements, who was a reporter and a writer at the Jiu-Jitsu Times, did this great article called something to the effect of "The call is coming from inside the gym." And her thesis was that, look, we have always marketed jiu-jitsu as being this amazing self-defense art, and we specifically market it towards women. And we say, like, this is the thing that's going to teach you how to defend yourself against attackers. And it kind of assumes this weird combat sports fantasy where you're walking down a dark alley and a stranger attacks you, and then you use your jujitsu to defend yourself. Whereas in reality, what seems to happen repeatedly is that it is the people in the jujitsu gym, the people that you came to learn to defend yourself, who are in fact often the ones who perpetrate the violence. And I would love to know your thoughts on this, not just from your perspective and the perspective of the other victims here, but in terms of what you think this says about the sport, that you got into the sport because, again, it was recommended to you by a friend as this great self-defense activity. And this is your first and primary experience with this, as well as many other women having this kind of experience. What does that say about the sport and the community? And what would the impression be of someone in your shoes who sees this kind of misconduct from well-known instructors in the sport?
So I think that's a really great question. And I would say that it's true that, I mean, I know of women who he targeted and victimized who spent time in women's shelters because, their former partners used to beat them up. There were women in there whose fathers were very physically abusive. There were women who'd come out of absolutely horrific experiences and who came into that gym to feel empowered and to feel a greater sense of being able to protect themselves and the people they love. And he weaponized that trauma against them. And I think he learned about their past experiences, gained their trust, and then in many instances molested them and touched them inappropriately. So for me, leaving was also, I didn't want another woman to walk through that gym and see me and mistake my presence there as vouching for this being a safe space. Um, and it's heartbreaking that I do think a lot of women can get so much out of this sport when the sport is done properly and when you have true leadership. But the ability for a predator to re-victimize these women is just so great at the same time.
Jesse and Shelby, I want to make sure that in addition to, of course, telling the story here, that we maybe share some evidence and some best practices to help people understand what is actually appropriate in jujitsu and what isn't. Because Jane, to your point, a lot of the time when you show up to a new jujitsu environment, it's already very intimidating, and you've got someone wearing a black belt, and like you said, everyone's very deferential to them, and it's easy to kind of get sucked into this almost like a cult of personality. And that makes it just so much harder to say no and advocate for yourself. But something that you said that was really scary from my perspective was you made it very clear that you did not consent to a role, and the role happened anyway. And Shelby and Jesse, I would love to hear maybe you two as gym owners riff on that a bit, and the importance of consent and why this matters, right? Because I bring this up because I'm sure some people will say it was just a role, bro. But the importance of, and this is not even a just related to sexual abuse in jiu-jitsu. This is really for anyone. The importance of consent in a role is so important, and I'd love to hear you two as gym owners maybe share some thoughts on that and what went wrong here.
It went wrong the moment he continued to force interaction when she said no. Even if all of the sexual energy that followed it didn't happen, the fact that the no is a complete sentence, and the fact that that wasn't respected, that in itself is its own problem. That needs to be a zero tolerance. Like, consent is the most important part of doing any sort of martial arts or interacting with another human being, especially when you're literally trusting that other human being with your physical body and mind. Like, I'm giving you the capacity to shred my shoulders and shred my knees. Like, I'm trusting you for that. And the fact that you won't take my language of, I'm not into this right now, like, red flags everywhere. It's a fireworks show of red flags.
I mean, to me, consent again, even separate from all of the sexual inappropriateness, consent is the only thing that makes this sport work, right? The slap and the bump is, in some ways, uh, a signal of consent, and the tap is then the removal of it. But it doesn't even have to go that far. I mean, like Shelby said, no is a complete sentence, and you can turn down a role for any reason, at any time, and there is no obligation to give any explanation. Um, that should be best practices standard across the board at every school. And if it is not, there is a fucking problem at that school.
And I mean, the whole consent discussion gets so much more complicated when the person who is denying consent is the head coach, right? I mean, because now you also have power dynamics in play. It's one thing if it's you and another white belt, it's still wildly inappropriate. But when the person who is perpetrating this is the head coach black belt, that is a completely different story, because you have to be mindful of the power dynamic at play. It already takes a lot of courage to say no in that case. And then to continue as the instructor to push the envelope there is very concerning. Jan, I'd love to maybe hear what happened next, because the interesting thing about this story isn't just your experience, but the sheer number of corroborating stories that you were able to uncover as well.
Yeah. So I think I left because I knew in my heart this wasn't going anywhere but to escalate further. So I left after a year and a half. And when I posted on Reddit, it was heartbreaking the number of women who came forward who'd been at that gym for longer, and what they were describing. And so, in my instance, it was a role I felt violated, but he didn't make any contact with my genitals, for instance. Other women who came forward have described him pinning them to the ground and then touching their clitoris and finding their clitoris while in gi pants. And so that's a very small part of the anatomy for someone to stumble upon. And for someone with that much jujitsu experience to find their way there, I don't believe at all is happenstance. I think that's hyper calculated. It's a sport that allows you to always be several moves ahead, and so finding your way there, I think, is just completely implausible unless you intend to do so. There are other women who describe him, them feeling him being aroused. Women in sports where there should be a lot less physical contact still ending up with him manipulating their hips and um, instances like that. So definitely a number of stories of unwanted touching. And to be clear, I think there's unwanted touching around your hips, your bum, your breasts, and then there's touching of genitals, which is clearly way over the line. There were also some really disquieting stories about sexualizing teenage girls, and I didn't personally witness that, but I do find that to be credible. And I think once again, as far as just sort of basic professional boundaries that gym owners should have, like I never took his phone number. I'm generally pretty careful about taking the phone number of married men, but I especially didn't want his phone number. But he was in contact with a number of women in the gym and not about the gym. It was all about things that were 1 degree or no degree away from sex. And I think that's also inappropriate and how a lot of this sort of got out of bounds. But I'll just say that the sexualizing of teenagers for me is worrisome. And I think there are certainly individual instances of where he was wholly inappropriate, but it's just for me really the number of women who have experienced this and for the number of years that they experienced it is what's truly jaw-dropping.
I think one of the things about jujitsu is it is still a very small sport. It doesn't get a lot of coverage. And I think sometimes that allows people in the sport to fly under the radar for a very long period of time. And to your point earlier, it can also make it very difficult for people to speak up. And it can make it very difficult for people to get their voices heard. I mean, I will say this about Reddit, especially the RBJJ community. I love to always rag on those guys and girls there and tease them because, you know, they're it's Reddit, right? But at the end of the day, a lot of probably the majority of the people that I've interacted with there, especially on the moderating crew, they have always taken this kind of stuff very seriously. And so I'm glad to hear that you had a good experience there with getting your story out. And as you mentioned, the one thing that is really distinct about this story is the sheer number of people who came out and corroborated what you have said here. And there's a lot of people who have been able to corroborate your claims on this, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And so certainly other women who said, "Yep, I saw that and I saw this." But also a number of men. And that was also quite sad as OP, I got a lot of DMs from men who were like, "I thought that there was something fishy and I wish that I had known this for sure, because I would have stood up, I would have done something." And then certainly I know that there will be men who, you know, will be integral to the investigation because they saw these things, or they heard about them most certainly. So there are really strong patterns among, I think, what folks experienced as far as leering, unwanted touching, a pregnancy fetish, offers of explicit photo shoots. All of those are sort of recurring themes among what those women experienced. And then there are men who validate that's also what they witnessed.
I think that's something that people need to be aware of. It is actually very hard to get action and to get the story out here. A challenge that I often see, often when this comes to social media, is when someone makes an accusation against a well-known coach, there will always be defenders and detractors who come out of the woodwork and either downplay it or cast doubts on it. And the challenge is the kind of culture around this and how hard it sometimes is for women to speak out about their experiences and the immediate pushback they get from people who often don't know anything about the case or the accusations at all. They just go right on the defensive on behalf of the accused. It's one of the things that makes it really challenging for these kinds of stories to come out. I'd love to know what that journey was like to kind of getting some degree of justice on this. Did you experience that kind of pushback or any difficulties in getting the story shared?
So I think that's a really interesting question. And I might try to answer that two ways. So I think that there's a significant cultural barrier to getting this out there. And I think Adam, for me, and I don't use this word lightly, has a cult-like following. And when folks were leaving that gym, it really did feel like they were being deprogrammed. There was an incredible amount of grief. There was reverse gaslighting. And it was very disorienting for the men and the women to look back and then to realize, oh my goodness, he did that to me too. He did that to my girlfriend. And so I think that it was really challenging to go up against him because he had so many people who respected him and revered him. He was particularly, I think, manipulative with men, and he came forward as a father figure or a big brother figure. He was particularly good at doing that with men who didn't have the type of father figures they deserved to have. So it was really challenging to sort of kill someone's hero or unmask someone's hero. I think there was like a real cultural impediment to that. And for me, it was a difficult decision to make because he has young children and those little boys have nothing to do with this. But if they Google their father's name, there are a lot of things there that I certainly wouldn't want to read about my dad. So I think there was just, I have to do this and it's going to be hard and I'm really going to be destroying somebody who has been highly respected within the community for a long time. And I was expecting to have some like meatheads or some people who just didn't believe it or some people who were really unkind. And I think fortunately the opposite happened. The the people who were on Reddit, with very few exceptions, were incredibly supportive. Some people had legitimate questions, and I think that's very fair. And I think that when you open up and share these types of experiences, you should be expecting folks to be curious, and you can answer questions to the best of your ability. But like the number of women who immediately corroborated, I think just added so much momentum to this. And then the broader community, both within the city's Reddit of Victoria and within the BJJ channel, I think were exceptional. And I will give a shout out to the mods in both those channels that someone tried to have those threads taken down, and those mods were really awesome and made sure that they stayed up. And, you know, there were some women who tried to share their stories and were getting blocked. They got those stories out there. So I would also say that if there are people in similar situations who are on the fence about whether to go public or not, my experience has been very positive. I've had a lot of really, really good support, like from within the community, from the media, and I was afraid but prepared. And I've been really pleasantly surprised at just how much support we've had.
I would also, I guess this is as good a time as any to ask, when these kinds of conversations come up, one of the comments that the detractors will often bring up is, well, why are you going public? Why didn't you just go to the police? Why not let the police handle this? And I'd love to get your perspective on that. I mean, I obviously have many thoughts myself, but I think it means more coming from you.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a valid question. So I chose to go public for a couple of reasons. And I'll say I chose Reddit for a couple of reasons. I left a Google review, and the algorithm on Google doesn't let you say a lot of the things I've been able to say on this podcast. It's also really easy for businesses to scrub those. So a single Google review wasn't going to do it. Reddit was a very helpful forum for, I think, explaining what had happened to me. I framed it as a public service announcement, and it was really just designed to warn other women not to go here. Or if you're going here and if your spidey senses are tingling, listen to them because they are right. And I wanted to do that just to reach the broadest audience possible. Then as other women started to join, and as I appreciated, my gosh, you know, this is way bigger and this is much more serious than what I thought was going on. Then I decided I'm going to go to the police. I'll be the first. And that way, if anybody, and I'll be the litmus test. If Victoria police are awful, then I can tell other women honestly that it was a horrible experience. Once again, my experience with Victoria police was really positive. They were great. And so then when there were women who thought about going to the police, I could tell them my experience was good. This is what it looks like. I can accompany you. And it builds more and more of a record, both legally and officially with the state, but also on the internet in places that he cannot control, that this is a bad guy. And I think that, again, if women know all of this and elect to train with him, that's their prerogative. But I would hate for some 20-year-old UVic student to join this gym because they want some self-empowerment, or for a teenage girl to do this to get in shape, and for them to meet that character uninformed, and for something horrible to happen to them because I didn't say anything.
And you touched on this earlier, but it's worth double clicking on, that this isn't just an issue that affects women. I mean, obviously they will bear the brunt of the harm here. But as you mentioned earlier, when you have a gym that uses cult-like tactics to control and manipulate members, it absolutely does impact men as well, just in other ways, right? First of all, seeing their sisters in the gym get harmed this way, but also they are just as likely to get exploited or manipulated for other purposes. I mean, we've talked about this quite a bit on many of the podcasts that I've been on, the kind of parallels between what I guess a traditional classic cult might do and the cult-like tactics that you will see in a lot of martial arts gyms. You'll see many of the same things, right down to hazing and ritual acts of humiliation and demands of tribute and the punishment of perceived disloyalty, a lot of the things that you've talked about right here. So this is Although often women are the ones who get victimized the most for the reasons that you've brought up, everyone in a cult like gym is going to get victimized as well. It's not just women. And so I think it needs to, I would always tell people, if you are a guy in a gym who has concerns, it is of the utmost importance that you speak up, right? It is of the utmost importance that you take the leadership on that and provide covering fire for the women in the gym so that they don't have to bear this burden on their own.
I think that's absolutely right. And Adam has a lot of red flags, and I think he's able to inflict tremendous psychological harm on men. And it's hyper manipulative. So I mean, I know that he's had free babysitting, free physical labor from folks at that gym. And some others have spoken about just sort of manipulative training. So he'll love you one day and ignore you the next, and then you'll do anything to, to gain his favor and his attention. And like none of that is what it should be. This is a business. Like I should be paying you to coach me, as opposed to entering into this, very psychologically complex uh like web of relationships. I would also say that a number of the men coming out of this scandal realized that their daughters, their girlfriends had been touched inappropriately, uh and that was really heartbreaking. And so I would say that yes, I it's the women who I think are being targeted in an overtly sexual way, but the damage that he caused to those men is not to be cheapened in any way. There was a lot of grief, and I think a lot of healing that's taking place for those who've left the gym.
One thing that's particularly unique about this case is that from just a completely outsider perspective, this gym gives off all of the signals that you would want to see in a safe place to train, right? You've got a couple running the gym, right? It's a family owned gym. There's a lot of women who train there. So just checking the boxes on the websites, these are often indicators that people might look at to think like, well, this gym is okay to train at. Sometimes when you hear stories like this, you read about the instructor and the way that they ran their gym, and you think to yourself, well, God, there were definitely some red flags there. But in this case, on its surface, this gym would have looked to a lot of people like a safe place to train, right? Especially given that, the wife is there at the same time. What are your thoughts on that? And from your learnings here, what are some of the indicators that you would maybe share so that someone in a similar situation can vet a gym and maybe see these subtle, hard to find red flags before they even appear?
Yeah, so again, I think that's right. And I was personally really comforted and inspired that, his wife was there. She's a black belt. She's smaller than me, and I was excited that there was someone who, I could train with who was closer to my weight class. I think in hindsight, I mean, certainly consent always has to be top of mind. So if you see instances where someone says no to a roll for whatever reason, because the other person rolls too hard, too soft, they're stinky, they have funky feet for whatever reason, and that's not respected, that's a hard line. Um, and then I would say if you notice people leaving the gym, you should find out why and find out why from them. Zuma also has a long history of people leaving and these exoduses happening. And then there was always a cover story and a gaslighting and this sort of like tribalism of like, well, if you dare ask them why they left, you're dead to me. And that to me was just absurd. Like, people that firstly, that tells me that they didn't leave because they moved or they didn't leave because of like an administrative challenge. They left because of an interpersonal challenge. But if people are leaving, get curious and ask why. And then I think if you notice that there are very few women, that also merits investigation. If you're a woman athlete training, so those are some of the flags I think in hindsight was just being alive to narratives that are being created about other people and sort of like if everybody's leaving and it's always their fault, it's never the gym's fault. Like that's bizarre. Like the gym is the common denominator here. And then any instance where no doesn't mean no. Again, I think to Shelby's point, that's just got to be paramount.
Awesome. Shelby, Jesse, I'd love to turn it over to you guys and maybe get some more questions from you or some feedback from you on this. I've mostly been kind of fielding a lot of the questions here, but is there anything that you wanted to ask or dig into?
Yeah, one of the things that, and we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but I would be really curious to explicitly talk about how much of this stuff was happening within earshot of other students, or out of earshot, or whether, uh, you know, the accused even seemed to care. I'd be curious about that. I'm also really curious as to um, what your perception was looking back. You may not have noticed at the time, but looking back, what role, if at all, did you feel like his wife played in enabling some of this behavior?
Yeah, so those are great questions. My experience was that he was very good at doing this in ways that were subtle and
Mhm.
in ways that the gym would dismiss. So when I told my brother about the interaction of me walking away for a minute and a half and telling him no, my brother was livid and he's like, "Well, why didn't everybody in that gym just like all quit that day?" And I just sort of had to explain like that was the culture. Like you didn't question him. And so I would say that he was good at keeping these interactions private, but even in those instances when they were more public, I think there was just a culture of not questioning him and staying within this sort of distorted version of reality that he'd created. Um, I know for other people who've described the inappropriate touching, that all happened, in the gym and in classes. So these weren't instances where, people were meeting up outside of class. It was always on the mat, but I think in a private corner sort of the mat. Um as far as his wife, I my personal experience with her was fairly limited. I don't find it credible that she could not know that this was going on. There are just so many instances of it over so many years. There were athletes who chose to have explicit photos taken of them by Adam. Those photo shoots, to my understanding, occurred within their home. And so I just don't see how you could be surprised that these are boundaries that have been crossed. When I left, I chose not to say why, but I know of 2 other women who left, and other men in their life were very clear that they were leaving because Adam had crossed the line, and that the line was sexual. And so I don't know how you sit down at the dinner table and this doesn't come up. All those gyms have cameras, and Zuma has very good cameras, so I just don't think it's plausible that she knew nothing. She perhaps didn't know the full extent of it. I think that she may not have known that these were, he's being accused of sexual assault. I don't know that she may have fully appreciated that, but I don't think it's credible that this is someone who learned of all of this for the first time when I posted on Reddit. And I say that with even more confidence in that in May of 2012 there was someone who posted on a website called The Dirty that called Adam a creep. And so this came up on the internet 13 years ago, and they would have known one another at that time. So I don't know exactly what she knows, but I don't think that this is someone who I don't think this was fully news to them, when I posted on Reddit.
Yeah. Shelby, have you got any questions?
I really have a question. I think what you're doing is amazing, and I'm so proud of you and so happy for you and the other 11, or if it's more now, that you guys are able to find each other and bring this public. N I can't imagine how you're feeling, but you did make several comments placing guilt on yourself, and that is not your burden. So just know that coming, like, as a business owner, as a woman that deals with women who are assaulted every day, That is not your burden to carry around on your shoulders. And you have absolutely zero guilt or burden to bear at all.
I
Well said.
appreciate that. That's kind.
This actually leads to an interesting point that I want to bring up. Often when these accusations are made, there will be some detractors who come out of the woodwork and cast doubt on the victim and say, well, maybe she's, I don't know, just doing this for attention, or they'll start attacking her character. This has been people often ask, well, why don't more women come out about this stuff if it's so widespread? It's because the personal cost to sharing the story is tremendous.
Just to interrupt you for a second, it's not only just that it's expensive, the cost is so great to the accusers, but how many accused do we see out there running entire countries now, right? It's so often that they go through this ordeal, and on the back end of it, there ends up being no justice.
Well, and rather, not to cut you off, rather than it being, this is my story and this was my experience, oftentimes, which it doesn't sound like it's what Jane has experienced, which is great, rather than it being like, this is my story and this is truth, it's convince us that this is your story and truth and bring receipts. So you're like, is this even going to be taken seriously? Am I going to go through all of this? And then they're going to be like, I don't know that we can believe you because it's just like hearsay. So it's hard. It's so hard for people to come forward.
Yeah, and the cost to people who come forward is tremendous as well. Someone who's become a good friend of mine over the years, Claudio Duval, a well-known jiu-jitsu black belt. She famously shared her story where she accused her instructor at the time, legendary grappler Ricardo De La Riva, of sexual abuse. And it's one thing to just share your story, but what was especially shocking to me was the harm that happened after the fact, after sharing the story. The number of De La Riva fanboys who went out of their way to harass her and make her miserable and reduce the quality of her life. So when people cast aspersions on the accusers here, what I think people need to understand is like these accusations are not made lightly. They tend to come at tremendous personal cost to the people making the accusations. Jane, I would love to know, how has this impacted you and the other people like you who have shared this story?
Yeah, so I think it is a really great point. And I'll say I took a long time to craft that Reddit post, and it's designed in a very specific way. It's a PSA about a woman's experience speaking to other women, and so it makes it challenging for a man to insert himself and to be like, "Well, I never experienced this." And it's like, "Well, no, you didn't, because this isn't about you." And so I will say that I was thoughtful about how to present the message and present it in a way that hopefully inoculated itself from some of those messages. I'm choosing not to use my name and not to use my face because I don't want this to be something that I'm affiliated with. If someone Googles my name, I don't want to have to tell my work about this. That being said, I have a very distinctive voice, and the people who know me know that this is me. The Zugecs know that this is me. It is not a very well-kept secret within our community who the OP is. And so I think that I am comfortable coming forward for those reasons, and I think just keeping it in that particular way. I also just went into this saying, I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to tell the truth on Reddit. I'm going to tell the truth to the police, and whatever happens, happens. And I thought, we might get a frivolous lawsuit, and even a frivolous lawsuit can be really expensive. I might get a bunch of idiots, a bunch of like really unkind dudes. I might get doxxed. And I had some good friends help protect me against that. Um, the other thing that I think I've been preparing for is for him to just try to scrub all of this off the internet. And again, I tried to be really thoughtful about that. So you can get Reddit taken down. It's hard, and we have some great mods, but you can get that taken down. Google reviews are very easy to have taken down. And this is why the media articles are so important. It's also, we created an open letter, and that open letter is hosted on a server that, like, will just never take this down. Um, and so I think it's about getting the message out there in places, like the media, like the open letter, where he can't scrub this off the internet. And that's what makes coming forward worth it, is having that staying power and making sure that he can't just whitewash and move on and pretend like this never happened.
Something that you bring up there, which is probably going to be surprising to a lot of people, is how easy it actually is to scrub stuff off the internet. People often think that it's just impossible. You can't take things off the internet, and maybe you never truly can permanently. You know, if you are a data forensics expert, you might be able to dig stuff up. But for the average person who's just looking to find information about a gym they want to sign up on, it's quite easy to do things like get negative Google reviews scrubbed or negative Yelp reviews. It's a lot easier than people would expect, right? There's very specific things in the terms of service for these sites that can allow the stuff to get scrubbed. And sometimes people who are well-meaning can actually make the situation worse. An example that comes up a lot is review bombing. So people who hear this story, their first inclination may be to go and post tremendously hateful or negative reviews on someone's website to tell that story. But the problem with doing that is if you, by doing so, cross over and violate the terms of service, you can actually make the case stronger for the person trying to get the review scrubbed that these things should get removed, right? I mean, if you've got a very clear coordinated review bomb effort happening on your Google reviews, where there's like 100 one-star negative reviews clearly about one particular thing, if you can convince Google that there was review bombing happening, they might scrub them all. So it is actually quite challenging to get your story told and have it stick for a long period of time. I mean, there's a lot of people who were accused of something terrible, 10 years ago, and they were able to wait it out. And these days, a lot of people don't even know this happened.
That's right. And the more publications we have, the harder and harder that would be. So even if somehow you were to convince Chek News to take down their article, then you'd have to convince CTV and Victoria Buzz and all the other articles that have come forward. And you'll never convince McDojo Life to take it down. Like Rob will hit the grave before that happens. And so I do think it's about having that staying power, because to your point, it's easy to drown out negative reviews with positive ones on Google. You can create new websites. You can rebrand the gym. And that seems to be what the gym is planning to do. So initially, after the first Reddit post, the gym had posted a public statement that they were going to go through an internal cultural review, and they were going to create a code of conduct. They've since deleted that. So we have no accountability, no apology, no public record of how they're doing anything. But if you look at their Google reviews, they're just aggressively having negative ones taken down. So it appears that they're just going to try to rebrand quietly and sweep this under the rug. And that's why podcasts like yours are so important at helping to create the record to keep people safe.
Yeah, this is a pattern that happens so often in the martial arts, where people will, if something happens at their gym, they will rebrand their gym to avoid that kind of scrutiny. Or in some cases, they will even change their name. I've seen that happen before too, where people have changed their name or their alias to make it harder to track down associations with things that they had done in the past, which might be more challenging. I mean, kind of an example that's very relevant right now is Derek Moneyberg, who kind of has a stage name, but his real name is tied to a lot of kind of shady stuff, right? There have been a lot of exposés that were able to trace it back to, well, if you Google this guy by his real name, you're going to find all sorts of interesting legal documents and things that don't really paint him in the best light. And it's easy to create a new alias. So I think, again, the big thing that I'm sure you have on your mind is, how do we make sure that this story has staying power, so that if 15 years from now, if someone Googles this guy's gym because they want to train with him, how can we make sure that this story continues to be told, and that this comes up as a warning for people who might want to train there in the future, so they at least know the history of what has happened. They know the history of these accusations, regardless of what winds up coming of this, at least making sure that information is available for future generations.
That's right. And I mean, one of my biggest concerns was, what if he just goes quiet, goes dark for a few years, but then volunteers to coach a high school girls wrestling team? And would this show up in a background check? I don't know. I'm not sure what'll happen with the police, but I really hope that if he pops up in other contexts and someone Googles his name, that they're going to see this and that there's a really strong red flag. I can't stop him from opening another gym. I can't stop him from rebranding. But what's been really powerful is also the media outlets that have named him, and that's hard to shake.
Jesse and I have talked about this in the past. A challenge that often comes up with cases like this is, and Shelby mentioned this earlier as well, um, sometimes people will expect this incredibly high bar to be cleared before they'll take the accusation seriously. Like they'll say things like, well, you can't really prove it. It's just your word versus his. Where's the evidence? As if these cases ever produce like tons and tons of evidence. But on top of that, people will often sometimes give passes for surprisingly bad behavior. An example that is very relevant to Jesse and myself, we did a whole podcast on this, was recent accusations against J-Rod, who was removed from the B team for inappropriate behavior. And to be clear, the accusations against him, he was not accused of sexual assault or anything that would be construed as a crime. It was just something that I think a reasonable person would consider to be unethical behavior in a gym, enough to get you, removed from your place of work or removed from your gym. The challenge that happens a lot is people will sometimes push back on this and say, well, there's no, it wasn't proven that a crime was committed, so we need to give this guy some grace. Or, well, yes, maybe he's being accused of touching someone inappropriately, but, it wasn't full definitive sexual assault. They might believe it's wiggle room. I obviously disagree with these stances, but you hear them a lot. I'm sure you've heard them. And I just love to get your thoughts on this particular aspect of the culture and whether that's been something that's impacted you as well.
Yeah, so I have heard that. And I would say that, a conviction for sexual assault is an extremely high bar. And there's a lot of misconduct beneath that I think would still make a gym inappropriate and would still make me not want to give money to that guy. And so whether he gets convicted of those things is beyond my control, but the conviction rate for sexual assault is less than 1%. And so it's extraordinarily difficult to do that. I would still just say my experience was an incredibly negative one. The experience of the other men at that gym was very negative. It's toxic, it's psychologically manipulative, and there's a good chance that if you're a female athlete that you're going to get touched inappropriately if you go into that gym. I think that's enough to go somewhere else. We've got lots of other, good gyms to choose from. And so I understand the argument, but at the same time, I think we're just really desensitized as a society to how much violence and criminality there is. And we should just set our standards a little bit better.
We've got to have a higher standard of conduct for day-to-day life than, well, he wasn't convicted of a crime. Like, there's got to be a higher standard of conduct. I mean, Shelby, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, because I know this is something that comes up a lot where people will say, well, he wasn't convicted of a crime, so we should let him still train here. But we have to, as a society, have a higher standard of conduct for each other than, is he in jail or not?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear you maybe expand on that, Shelby, as a gym owner.
I mean, you can boil it down to when people show you who they are, you believe them, and then you act accordingly. That often, in my experience in our gym, it starts subtle, kind of like putting the feelers out. They're little tentacles of doom. Like, oh, how far can I take it? How far can I get away with? What if I say this? Then what happens? What if I say this? Then what happens? And you have to shut it down. You like that, like standard operation is we don't fuck people at the gym. We don't let people try to fuck people at the gym. We don't have sex in the gym. There's no sexual energy in the gym. This is a place for intimacy that does not equate sex. Intimacy and vulnerability, because we're trusting each other with our bodies and we're trusting each other to be very, very intimately close with one another, and that does not equate sex. You don't let it be there.
I specifically liked what you said about normalization, about how refusing to let this be normalized and cutting it off at the bud. Because, I mean, Jane, to your point, in your story, this didn't start at the worst case scenario. This started with inappropriate comments that maybe at first could be given the benefit of the doubt if you wanted to, but then they escalated and escalated and escalated. And every time this is, of course, unfortunately not going to happen in your situation, but for the head coaches out there, every time you allow this kind of stuff to be normalized, it gives that person tacit permission to keep doing it. And then they're going to keep pushing the envelope and turning the dial up. And so the desire to avoid conflict in the gym and the failure to call this stuff out and stop it right away, it just enables more of it and worse behavior in the future. So that's why it's so important for gym owners and leaders to stop this stuff right away. And moreover, it's so cowardly for gym owners and leaders to allow this to happen because they just don't want to cause a scene, right? That's how a lot of these terrible things happen at gyms. At some point, a leader or a gym instructor, they saw it and they decided, well, I just don't want to cause a scene. It's just, this one I can let it slide. And then every time the dial of unethical behavior gets turned up just a little bit, and before you know it, really terrible things start happening. So
It is a cancer, and if you let it metastasize, it will ruin a school. It will ruin an academy.
Like
It's zero tolerance.
we've had conversations in our gym. We had an individual that I can't even remember exactly what he was commenting on. He was talking about like she smelled good or something. Something that was innocuous but still weird. And I went to him and I was like, "Hey, that's not a thing that we do." He was like, "You make oil check jokes." I was like, "There's a very different concept in making an oil check joke to an entire room of people that is not isolating an individual sexually versus me and you making eye contact with one another and I'm commenting person. Those are two very different instances."
Yeah, and I think with Adam, conviction or not, over a dozen women felt unsafe in his presence and unsafe enough to leave. And I just don't think that you should have anybody who makes you feel unsafe in the gym. Someone who's gonna like do a move they're not supposed to or jerk your knees around. Like if they're unsafe, get them off the mat. And for women, they're feeling unsafe in a way that might not resonate with men, but it's someone in that gym who brings a lack of safety, and that's in no one's best interest.
Yeah, and then it's a person in power, and you behaving that way as the person in power gives permission for everyone else to do that as well. But then the weird manipulative, I'm the cult leader, everybody wash my feet and lick the palms of my hands because I am a god among you all. Like, it's gross. It's really gross.
Well, Jane, I guess one last thing I'd like to ask you here. If you could see any changes to the jiu-jitsu community in terms of how people could handle these situations better and prevent them from happening, based on the expectations and based on what you've seen from your own experience and that of the other people involved in this, what do you think are the big changes that should be made that could make the sport safer for everybody involved?
That's a great question. So I know that some jurisdictions have talked about legislation and background checks and just maybe having more sort of formal oversight for gyms. I don't know that I know enough about that to comment there. But what I think would be helpful for the community overall is for athletes who feel uncomfortable to share that experience. And I know for all the other women who I've spoken to, they really wish that they had had this conversation earlier. They really wish that they had told someone in the moment, after Adam touched them inappropriately, after he made them feel uncomfortable. And so I think it's getting back to that root that you discussed of like, how high is the bar? And the bar shouldn't be a criminal conviction. If your spidey sense is going off that someone is sexualizing you and bringing in energy that makes you feel uncomfortable and unsafe, talk about it. That's an important part of creating, a meaningful and deep gym community and culture. I think that's the part for me that would have been so much better, is just if we'd had this conversation a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I mean, the really disappointing thing in this case is, like you said, you were able to find some degree of evidence going back over a decade that there had been complaints about this guy's conduct in the past, and for that to go unaddressed for so long is really sad. That's as someone for people who've been around the sport for a while, one of the things that they will have noticed is that this kind of problem is way more frequent than a lot of people think. Often when people push back on the stuff, you'll hear a lot of white and blue belts hear a story like this and say things like, well, I'm glad that doesn't happen at my gym, or my gym's not like that, or, well, I've never seen that problem. And my answer to that is usually, that doesn't happen at your gym that you know of, right? That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Just because it hasn't impacted you personally, or you haven't been clued into the fact that this is happening, that doesn't mean it's not. The amount of cases that I've seen of this in my journey, just from gyms nearby me, I mean, many cases of this kind of thing happening. There was just a few years ago, there was a guy who was teaching jujitsu and MMA in the neighboring city of mine, and he had to flee the country because he was being investigated by the RCMP for misconduct with a minor. Like this kind of stuff happens a lot more common in the martial arts than people think it does. So for the people who like to downplay this or say, well, I don't think it's actually that widespread a problem, your eyes will probably be opened at some point. It is much more widespread than really any of us should be comfortable with. Yeah. Well, awesome, Jane. Call to action here for listeners out there. Is there anything that you would like to see people do to support your case here, or to just in general to improve the quality of the sport overall? We already talked about the importance of speaking up, but any initiatives you want to plug or anything like that?
Well, firstly, I'm just immensely grateful to everyone who's listened, and who cares about this story and is passionate. If there's anyone listening who's directly affected by Adam Zugec and what's happened at Zuma, please know that you're not alone and that your experiences matter. The community's been incredibly supportive. To anyone who's considering going to the Victoria Police Department, I am the OP on Reddit. You can feel free to DM me there. I'm happy to walk you through what that would look like. I'll physically accompany you if you're nervous or scared. And please just know that your voice has a lot of power here. And I think as a community, it's just really, really important to continue to shine a light into dark corners and to listen to those quiet voices.
And if people want to message you on Reddit, how do they go about doing that? Do you remember your username?
It's Forsaken Credit and then a bunch of numbers at the end, but
It was a leading question. I got it in front of me. It's Forsaken dash credit 3963. Obviously one of the default generated usernames, but I will make it easier for people to find. I'll drop a link to that in the show notes so that if people want to message you, they can do that more easily.
that's wicked. We also do have an open letter for anyone who's interested in signing that. You provide an email address, which goes to me. I'm not going to send you anything or sell you anything, but that open letter essentially asks for Adam to apologize and take accountability for his actions. So if we could link that too, that would be great.
I will do that as well. So that'll be in the show notes too. And yeah, this is an important initiative. So, I mean, obviously you've got our support, and hopefully people listening to this are inspired to take action as well. But Jane, thank you so much for doing this. Again, I know it is not an easy project to take on. I know that this kind of stuff comes at tremendous personal cost that a lot of people don't understand. So just thank you for doing this. Thank you for doing your part to keep the sport cleaner.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you.
So
Thank you
much.
for using your platform to help empower women and seek some justice here, make the sport better and cleaner.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, amazing. Well, thank you to the listeners as well. And we will talk to you in the next one. See you then.